Step into my dojo and feel my claws, Travis.
Hey look, I'm back from the dead again. Anyway, since the previous Iceberg video did so well, I thought I'd make another one since I'm pretty close to 500 subscribers. This time it'll be the video game localization iceberg. If you don't know what a localization is, it's basically the process of bringing something to a foreign market. You know, like translating and releasing a Japanese game in a European country, for example. Oftentimes, changes are made during these localizations to appeal to different cultures more, so it is mostly just Japanese shit getting toned down for pussy Americans. Over the years, there's been some interesting shit that's happened as a result of localization, so let's just shut up and get into it. Balrog / Vega / M. Bison. Ah yes, truly one of the most famous examples of localization. If you somehow don't know, in the Japanese version of Street Fighter II, the dictator guy was Vega, the claw guy was called Balrog, and the boxer guy was called M. Bison. It's pretty obvious that Capcom USA didn't want to get into trouble with Mike Tyson's legal team with a character that's unmistakably based on him, so they opted to switch the name around. Balrog became Vega, Vega became M. Bison, and M. Bison became Balrog. These characters are often referred to as just Boxer, Claw, and Dictator to avoid confusion, and Capcom's gone on to poke fun at this in later games. Personally, I prefer the localized names, but that's probably just because I grew up with those. Doki Doki Panic. Okay, this one is so famous that it's practically a meme at this point. We all know the story. Lost Levels was considered too hard and samey for us dumb westerners, so we got a reskin of some game called Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic. What you might not know is that Doki Doki Panic was originally a prototype for a Mario game, and it was gonna have this sick-ass remix of the Underground theme. So in the end, it actually came full circle. You probably know this too, but I'm just gonna say it anyway. Our version of Mario 2 was later released in Japan as Super Mario USA, so that's neat. Peach and Bowser get drunk in Super Mario Kart. Yeah, they get pissed up in the Japanese version. Four Fingers and Gangs. I don't know, something to do with the Yakuza members often having a missing finger or some shit results in characters with 4 fingers being changed to have 5 fingers. You ever wanted to see Bart Simpson with 5 fingers? Well, here you go. It's likely that this change is also made because 4 is considered an unlucky number in Japan, with the pronunciation of it being identical for the Japanese word for death, which is shi. American Kirby is hardcore. Ever since Nightmare in Dreamland, it's been a tradition to alter the box art to make Kirby look fucking pissed for the American box art. I don't know why, but it's pretty funny. Paper Mario transgender character. In the Japanese version of Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, the character Vivian was a tranny. Thankfully this was removed from the Western version. Cheeseburgers and Alex Kidd. Ah yes, those gosh darn jelly-filled donuts strike again. When you beat a level in Alex Kidd, you'll see Alex eating a jelly-filled donut, but for whatever reason this was changed to a burger in the version that came built into the Master System Model 2, which is the version I have. You spoony bard. This one's a bit of a rabbit hole, but basically when dumbing down Final Fantasy IV for Americans, one of the translators had the character Teller say the infamous line, "You spoony bard," which obviously sounds a bit goofy, especially for what was originally supposed to be a serious scene. The line has since gone on to be not only a massive in-joke between Final Fantasy fans, but also a go-to example of shoddy translation. Square themselves have gone on to poke fun at this line several times, and the line is still included in translations of Final Fantasy IV to this very day. Eggman / Robotnik. Another famous example of localization changes. Despite what retarded boomers on YouTube might tell you, in Japan, Dr. Eggman was always called Eggman. But Sega of America decided to change his name to Dr. Robotnik to sound more threatening, and despite the name getting changed back to Eggman for all regions in Sonic Adventure, The Robotnik name stuck, and it was retconned so that Eggman was a nickname and Robotnik was his actual name. Honestly, I like both names. It's just a shame about all those other changes that Sega of America had to make. Mass System in Brazil. Everyone seems to have this false idea of the Mass System being a flop, and while this is true for Japan and USA, the Mass System was very popular in Europe and it was fucking huge in Brazil, where it ended up getting like 30 exclusive games well into the life of the Saturn, including a port of the worst 2D Sonic game ever. Brazil's pretty cool. Melee Tamagon Trophy. In the Japanese version of Super Smash Bros. Melee, there's a trophy based on the character Tamagon from Devil World on the NES. Most likely due to his connection to a game with heavy religious themes, he went unused in the North American version, albeit with a fully translated trophy description. Funnily enough, the trophy was outright removed in the European version, despite the fact that Devil World actually got a European release. Tetris Attack / Panel de Pon. Similar to Puyo Puyo, Japanese puzzle game Panel de Pon got reskinned as Tetris Attack in the West, and all the anime girls were replaced by Yoshi for some fucking reason. Earthbound Beginnings. The original Mother game was gonna get localized, but the localization got cancelled due to it being close to the release of the Super Nintendo or some shit. We eventually got the localization on the Wii U as Earthbound Beginnings. NES redesigned to look like a computer. Kind of. The localized version of the Famicom was originally going to look like this at one point, but then they decided to go back to the drawing board and make it look like a VCR to appeal to toy shops or some shit, and that's why the NES looks so different from the Famicom. Puyo Puyo reskins. Japanese puzzle game series Puyo Puyo got reskinned numerous times as Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, Kirby's Avalanche, Quirks, and Cranky Food Friends? What the fuck? Turn this train spastic. So in Mario Party 8, Kamek says the line, "Turn this train spastic," which in most regions doesn't really mean anything. However, in my homeland, the UK, spastic is considered to be a derogatory term for, well, retarded people. It got censored eventually, but if I remember correctly, there's still some European copies that have it. Melee PAL balancing. The PAL version of Melee actually had some balance tweaks, with characters getting numerous buffs and nerfs here and there. It's slightly less of a broken mess, I suppose. SSBM Tutorials did a pretty good job covering the most notable changes, and there's also a page on the Smash Wiki that lists every change, so if you're curious, check that out. Music game soundtrack replacement.
Well, that's almost a sentence.
Some games have different soundtracks across regions. Notable examples include the USA version of Sonic CD, the Korean versions of various Guilty Gear games, and Biometal on the Super Nintendo, where they replaced the music for the Western versions with songs from the techno group Too Unlimited, which even to this day I find incredibly bizarre. Japanese games and blood types. So you ever wonder why in Japanese games, blood types are often listed in character bios? Well, simply put, Japanese people tend to believe that blood type determines a person's personality. I really can't be asked to list what each blood type represents, but yeah, there you go. Japanese Crash Bandicoot music and design. I already covered this in my Crash Iceberg video, but basically in Japan they made Crash really cute in order to appeal to Japanese players, and it's one of the few examples of a Western game franchise being popular in Japan. Though for some reason they replaced a bunch of music in the Japanese version of Crash 1 and all of the replaced music sounds like dog shit. Hell in Jamalami. This one's actually pretty fucking funny. So in the Japanese and European versions of Jamalami, there's a part where Lamy fucking dies and goes to hell. However, for the American version, she just gets catapulted to an island in a completely different FMV cutscene, and she even has a unique outfit for this new island level. It's bizarre that they went through this much trouble, resulting in two different English localizations. Battletoads is easier in Japan. Everyone's favourite old school 4chan joke, Battletoads, is notoriously really fucking hard, partially to combat the rental market. However, since renting games is illegal in Japan, they decided to tone it down a bit, so there's many small changes here and there and the game's a bit more manageable overall. Kinda defeating the point of Battletoads in the first place. Force drama in Sonic Forces. You know, it makes me laugh. Probably the only time I've seen Sonic fans collectively agree on something is with Sonic Forces being dog shit. Well anyway, you remember the line where they say something along the lines of Sonic's been tortured for around 6 months? Yeah, well that's just something the hack writers pulled out of their asses. There is nothing remotely similar to that line in the Japanese script. Xenoblade had British accents. Xenoblade had British... Oh, I'll eventually fucking pronounce this shit. Xenoblade had British accents because of a recycled localizations. Fuck! Xenoblade had British accents because of a God, I can't fucking do this. Xenoblade had British accents because of a recycled localization. Apparently Xenoblade Chronicles originally wasn't going to be released in America. The plan was just to release it in Europe and Japan, but eventually they decided to just release the European localization in America. And that's the story of how Xenoblade characters got their iconic British accents. Blue Dreamcast logo. In Japan, the Dreamcast swirl was orange. In America, it was red. And in Europe, it was blue. Again, maybe it's because I grew up with the European Dreamcast, but I way prefer the blue swirl. I think it fits with the Sega branding a lot more. Marlboro parody in Mario Kart 64. The Japanese version of Mario Kart 64 had a bunch of parodies of real-life brands. The localizers likely either got scared of possible legal action, or it simply just didn't sit well with them that they could possibly be advertising fags in a kids game. It's a shame they were removed though, because stuff like this gives more personality to the game. NES Zapper / gun. In Japan, the NES Zapper looked like this. I wonder why they changed it. Nordic Mr. Gimmick. For some reason, the Famicom game Mr. Gimmick was only localized outside of Japan in Scandinavia, of all places. As the Japanese version has a custom sound chip that only works with the Famicom, the music in the Scandinavian version is a bit toned down, but it still sounds quite advanced for an NES game. South Park The Stick of Truth, Peggy censorship. This image pretty much explains everything you need to know. Though apparently this censorship in Europe was completely unnecessary, and we can blame Ubisoft for this. Thanks for helping to ruin the gaming industry, you fucking cunts. Dynamite Headdy had a plot. Dynamite Headdy could be considered a butchered localization. While the Western version is still fun, they made it unnecessarily harder, redrew a bunch of sprites, and removed most of the character dialogue. I get increasing the difficulty for Western players to combat the rental market, but I really don't get the other changes. Gruntilda's body parts in a bag. In the Japanese version of Banjo-Tooie's ending, Gruntilda's decapitated head is replaced with a sack. This is probably because the Japanese government became massive pussies to video game violence towards the end of the 90s. Tingle games. That weird fucking Tingle guy got a bunch of spin-off games that were only released in Japan, though we did get the first Tingle game here in Europe. Pokemon Golden Nuggets. Apparently this one's referring to a reoccurring dirty joke to do with Golden Nuggets and Japanese versions of Pokemon games, where an NPC would say something along the lines of, "Here's an old man's ball. I hope you put it to good use," before giving you the Golden Nugget. This was removed internationally. IQ. IQ is essentially Nintendo's branding in China. Since China's a shithole and banned consoles, Nintendo had to find loopholes and release plug-and-play consoles there featuring various N64 games built in or some shit. Mother 3 wasn't localized due to pro-communist themes. Okay, so this is a rabbit hole I'm not willing to get too deep into since I've never really played any of the Mother games, but a quick skim through a Game FAQs thread suggests that Mother 3 is against capitalism going too far rather than being outright pro-communism. I think with this entry it's just looking too deep into shit, and the real reason that the game never got localized is just likely because it's really fucking dark. Also, Earthbound sold like shit. Ice Climber Seal Clubbing. The Japanese version of Ice Climber has these seal enemies, whereas the Western version replaced them with these Yeti enemies. This was censored because of the infamous seal hunting that goes on in a handful of areas across the world, where people just fucking beat seals to death with pickaxes and clubs. Oftentimes baby seals. Thanks, Canada. Shoshinsha mark. This symbol is used to show that someone's a beginner driver in Japan. Basically the Japanese equivalent to the red L or green P that we have. Princess on Ice. So Arc System Works released a cute anime rhythm game on the DS, but when 505 Games localized it, they decided to make it into guaranteed bargain bin fodder. It's not all bad though. The sequel/spin-off Happy Star Band kept the anime style for the American version, where it's known as Rocking Pretty. Though once again 505 Games made it into bargain bin bait for Europe. Crazy Castle Kid Clown Connection. Ugh, fucking hell, I'm gonna need a drink for this. The Crazy Castle series is a massive rabbit hole full of multiple regional skins and all that fuckery, so let's just go through this game by game. So the first Crazy Castle game was released for the Famicom Disk System, and was actually just a Roger Rabbit game in Japan. But because there was already a Roger Rabbit game for the NES in the West, when they localized it for Americans, they reskinned it as the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle. Now there's the first Game Boy game. In Japan, it was Mickey Mouse. In the West, it was once again the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle. The second Game Boy game was Mickey Mouse 2 in Japan, the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 2 in America, and simply just Mickey Mouse in Europe, until they decided to re-release it in Europe again as Hugo. Both Bugs Bunny Game Boy games were then released on a single cart in Japan as the Bugs Bunny Collection. For the second NES game, it was Mickey Mouse 3 in Japan and Kid Clown in America. This would go on to spawn its own series, which would also end up having various Japan-only games, despite the first one only being released in America. Now for the third Game Boy game, it was Mickey Mouse 4 in Japan, The Real Ghostbusters in America, and Garfield Labyrinth in Europe. By the way, try to remember this one as we'll be coming back to it later on in the Iceberg. Thankfully for the fourth Game Boy game, it's a Mickey Mouse game in all regions, Mickey Mouse 5 in Japan and Germany for some reason, and Mickey Mouse Magic Wands in America. The fifth Game Boy game was originally released in Japan only as a Kid Clown game. However, when it got ported to the Game Boy Color a couple years later, it was rebranded everywhere, including Japan, as Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 3. The sixth Game Boy game / second Game Boy Color game was just Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 4 everywhere. Then the final Crazy Castle game, and the only one on GBA, was Woody Woodpecker Crazy Castle 5 everywhere. Oh, and there was also a port of the NES Bugs Bunny game for old Java phones, simply called Crazy Castle. Jesus fucking Christ. Konami characters in Scribblenauts. Konami published the first two Scribblenauts games in Japan, so there's a ton of Konami characters exclusive to the Japanese versions. These include Solid Snake, Old Snake, and Big Boss from Metal Gear, Goemon and Ebisu Maru from the Goemon series, Alucard from Castlevania, Pawapuro-kun from that one baseball series Konami does, Shiori Fujisaki from Tokimeki Memorial, Manaka Tanake from Love Plus, the fucking Vic Viper from Gradius, and Mimi and Yami from Poppin' Music. Never without a condom. In the German version of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, the Cookman enemy had its dialogue changed to say suggestive things such as "Give me your juice, I'll give you mine," and "Never without a condom." Needless to say, these were removed in later versions. 7-Up removed from European Cool Spot. Cool Spot wasn't the mascot of 7-Up in Europe. Instead, we had Fido Dido. So all the 7-Up branding was removed from the European version and was replaced with Virgin branding as Virgin Interactive made the game. Alex Kidd gets stripped naked. In the Japanese version of Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle, when you lose a game of rock, paper, scissors, Alex gets stripped naked and dies of embarrassment. This was changed to a weight dropping on your head in every other version. Big-breasted Tiger Pikachu. According to an interview, Nintendo of America thought Pikachu looked too cute and proposed some redesigns, including one where it was a tiger girl with huge tits. Remember, this was Nintendo in the mid-90s, the era of Donkey Kong Country and fat people exploding in Yoshi's Island adverts. Crazy to think of a world where Pikachu was a Japan-only thing, but not gonna lie, I actually kinda wanna see this design get leaked, so I can jack off to all the lewd fan art assuming it looks like a Kemono Mimi and not disgusting western furry shit. Dog's life ending censored. This game has a really fucked up ending. Despite being a kid's game, the last level takes place in a factory where dogs are killed and turned into cat food. There's fucking blood splatters all over the machinery. 3+, you say? Anyway, the blood is removed in the Japanese version and the ending cuts off before you see the villain getting turned into cat food. Game & Watch Gallery numbers. This is another crazy castle situation, so let's just get through this as quickly as possible. So Nintendo remade a bunch of Game & Watch games for the Game Boy. The first compilation was only released in Europe and Australia, and was called Game Boy Gallery. The second compilation was called Game & Watch Gallery in the US and Europe, Game Boy Gallery 2 in Australia, and Game Boy Gallery in Japan. The naming scheme then stayed consistent until the GBA compilation, which was Game & Watch Gallery 4 in the US, Game & Watch Gallery Advance in Europe and Australia, and Game Boy Gallery 4 in Japan. Rayman M renamed because of M rating. Pretty much as it says, Rayman M was renamed to Rayman Arena in America due to the ESRB rating system's M rating possibly causing confusion. Star Tropics was developed in Japan. Despite being a first-party game developed by Japanese people for a Japanese console, Star Tropics was only made for a Western audience in mind and was never released in Japan, nor was it intended to be released in Japan. Crash Bandicoot flattening resembling serial murders. So this one death animation from Crash Bandicoot 2 was removed from the Japanese version because at the time in Japan there was a serial killer going around leaving people's decapitated heads next to their shoes. I don't have anything to add to this one, it's just fucked up. Dragon Ball game localized before anime. So the shitty Dragon Ball Famicom game, Dragon Ball Shenlong no Nazo, was the first Dragon Ball thing to ever get localized in English-speaking territories, even before that awful Harmony Gold dub. It was reskinned as Dragon Power, and there's tons of censorship with early Dragon Ball being, well, early Dragon Ball. Reskinning anime games for a Western audience wasn't too uncommon back in the 80s and 90s. Some other examples include Fist of the North Star games getting reskinned as Black Belt and Last Battle, a Ranma game getting reskinned as Street Combat, and a Captain Tsubasa game getting reskinned to Tecmo Cup Soccer, just to name a few. Palutena turns Pit into an adult. The Western version of Kid Icarus adds an ending that wasn't in the Japanese version, where Palutena turns Pit into an owl and falls in love with him. Alternatively, the Japanese version has an exclusive ending where Palutena turns Pit into whatever the fuck this thing is. Man, I wanna fuck Palutena. Japanese Gex's soft core. Well, there's not too much information about this one on the cutting room floor, so I'm kind of fucked with this one. But from what I can gather, Gex 1's localization was a fairly standard localization where the only difference was the intro cutscene being dubbed. Gex 2 on the other hand was renamed to Spintail, and the character himself was renamed to Reno, despite Gex 1 being called Gex in Japan, with the main character also being called Gex in Japan. Reno was also voiced by Japanese funny man Mitsuo Senda. Gex 3 wasn't localized. Earthbound Spacebound copyright. I couldn't really find anything about this one through a 5-minute Google search aside from some wiki page that claimed Nintendo was thinking of localizing Mother 2 as Spacebound before they settled on Earthbound. So fuck it, there you go. Unbeatable DOS TMNT. Shitty Western developed computer ports of NES games weren't too uncommon back in the 80s. For example, there was a port of the NES version of Metal Gear for the Commodore 64, and legendarily awful ports of Castlevania and Ninja Gaiden 2 for the Amiga. Well, this time we have a port of Konami's first NES Ninja Turtles game on DOS. This port is infamous for having this gap that's fairly early in the game that's just impossible to jump over. The European version did actually fix this, but Americans got fucked over hard. Blackface in Doki Doki Panic. One of the items you can pull out of the ground in Doki Doki Panic is straight up just blackface. This was changed to a Koopa shell in Super Mario USA. I'm Sorry released in the US despite being themed around Japanese politicians. So in the mid-80s, Sega published an arcade game taking the piss out of former Prime Minister of Japan, Kakuei Tanaka, who was in a scandal at the time due to taking bribes or some shit. The name I'm Sorry is actually a pun on the Japanese word for Prime Minister, Sori, and apparently this game was quite successful in Japanese arcades. Anyway, yeah, there was bizarrely enough a US release of this game despite it being about Japanese politics. So that's interesting. Gambling in Sonic's Game World for Pico. If you don't know, the Sega Pico was Sega's attempt at one of those educational console things. There were a couple of Sonic games for it, and the Japanese version of Sonic's Game World had a level set in a casino, which was just outright removed in the Western version. Campaign to ban Wind Mine. Around the late 90s, early noughties, a bunch of Karens banded together in Italy to get Minesweeper banned from Windows operating systems, claiming it's offensive to mine victims. So Microsoft reskinned Minesweeper to Prato Fiorito in Italy, where all of the mines were replaced by flowers. I mean, this is just fucking borderline parody. Alternate Pac-Man ghost names. In Japan, the names of the ghosts are named after their AI routines, with their nicknames being their colour. There's also a dip switch exclusive to the Japanese version that changes the ghosts' names and nicknames to another set, but this was dummied out of the Western version, and if you try and re-enable it, the ghosts' names are just replaced by strings of letters. Puzzlo Kids. As discussed earlier, Puyo Puyo has a history of having tons of weird localizations. The strangest oddity of all is what happens when you put a Japanese copy of Puyo Puyo for the Game Gear into a Western Game Gear. Now, some Game Gear cartridges have regional detection and will change the game depending on the region, and despite Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine being on the Game Gear, it seems Compile were planning to make a more faithful adaptation, as when you put Puyo into a Western Game Gear, you get a fully localized version of the first Puyo game, known as Puzzlo Kids. Despite the fact that there was already a localized version of the arcade version of Puyo, where it was still called Puyo Puyo. This is hurting my head. Moving on. And now to the final entry. Garfield and Odie are gay in Garfield Labyrinth. Okay, so remember that segment where I was talking about the Crazy Castle rabbit hole? Well, as I said, there was a Garfield game that was a reskin of a Mickey Mouse game. Either the developers were on a strict deadline, or they simply just didn't know what Garfield was all about, because they didn't bother to change the ending outside of the reskinned graphics. And, well, just see for yourself. Well, I hope you enjoy me reading off a bunch of cutting room floor articles. This iceberg was a bit weird. The image makes it look like it's only the first half since it doesn't even cover the whole iceberg. And another critique I have is I feel there's way too many entries crammed in the first two layers compared to the rest. The next iceberg is gonna be the sexual kink / fetish iceberg, and I'm not even joking, I will fucking do it. Credit to Waluigi Bubsy Plock on Reddit for making this iceberg, and special thanks to all the folks at the cutting room floor for providing most of this information. I'm getting close to 500 subscribers, so let's hopefully break that barrier soon.
And when we're coming, you're gonna hear this. How when we're coming, you're gonna hear this. How when we're coming, you're gonna hear this. Let me tell you something about them jokers. The motherfucking, I'ma put you in the grave, kill the family. It's so true, you better move.